Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and in this video I'd like to talk a little bit about Chapter 6, Drugs and Law Enforcement. But before I get into that material from your textbook, I want to talk about a fascinating study. And this study is by Gamma et al., and it's published in 2016 in PLOS One, and it's titled, "Could Google Trends be used to predict methamphetamine-related crime? An analysis of search volume data in Switzerland, Germany, and Austria." Basically, the authors used Google Trends looking at meth searches and then correlating that with related crimes, and they found that there is indeed a relationship, a correlation. What this means basically, from a research perspective and also from an investigatory perspective and a policy and planning perspective, is that we may be able to use Google Trends to predict what kind of problems we're going to see or we should be addressing right away, or what's going to be problems in the future. So there's all kinds of possibilities here. I've used Google Trends before to look at some changes in what people are searching for, and when some event occurs that is out of the ordinary or unusual event, we should say. You can have a lot of fun with Google Trends too. I mean, you can put anything in there, and there's been some studies that looked at features such as indicators which might relate to certain mental disorders such as depression. They've looked at pornography search usage. They've looked at flu-related symptoms. I mean, it's really endless. But I think here the authors look at search volume data as relates to meth over a number of years, and I think that really is an interesting model, and I'd like to see more of that done. So that, and probably as we progress with our technology, it will become more advanced, and we can get more real-time specific data, and so this may help us address problems or try to figure out what else we need to do research-wise to go in to communities where a lot of search is going on to find out if there's a problem or if there needs to be some interventions or whatever. So interesting to think about. Okay, so we know that the criminal justice system plays a huge role in the response to drug abuse, and so you know, whether it's enforcement of drug laws or adjudication through the criminal justice system, the court system, or implementing penalties, huge amounts of money are spent dealing with drug-related issues and problems. There's always going to be that debate on should we be spending money, and again, this really isn't one or the other, because we're obviously, you know, I guess the question would be, should we put more money into law enforcement and drug control, or treatment and prevention? What your authors kind of refer to as the supply and demand related issues. But you know, there's a big debate about that all the time. You know, if you think about your community gets funding to deal with drug problems, let's say $10 million, where should that money go? So, you know, there's going to be a lot of debate about that. Obviously, some would argue a certain proportion to law enforcement. Others would argue, you know, a certain proportion, or just how would you proportion that out, let's say, between law enforcement and treatment and prevention. So think about that and the rationales behind that and the like. Your authors kind of point out it's evenly split when we look at the budget in 2017. So there's different ways that law enforcement attempts to control drugs, from crop eradication to U.S. certification process to control of refining agents. So there's a lot of ways that law enforcement can go ahead and work in those scenarios. And so, of course, identifying the problem lead to possible interventions. And so, there's a section on crop eradication programs, and I think it's always important to look at the pros and the cons, and the unintended consequences as well. Chemical controls, U.S. certification, where what we have is the evaluation of the cooperation of other countries in counter drug efforts, and this is related to foreign aid being awarded. So there's a financial, motivation for countries to cooperate that receiving foreign aid or would like to. And then also denying drug smugglers ways into the country by air, land, or sea, and we obviously have a lot of that going on, and so obviously, like you get one, like airport security is become very secure, basically, and so traffickers are probably going to avoid trying to have some illegal drugs through commercial flights. That obviously be a very easy way to get caught, so they have to find other ways. There's a lot of agencies involved, and the federal agencies include, for example, the DEA, the Customs and Borders, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Coast Guard and the military. And there's some really good information about the different agencies and their roles, and how they work together, and some of their methodologies. And so a lot of useful information there. The U.S. military basically has some amazing technologies that can be used to provide intelligence to other agencies. And of course, there's a lot of debate when we get down to looking at how does law enforcement pursue those that they believe are engaged in illegal drug activities. And there's also a section on street level drug law enforcement, and again, you have task forces working together. You have hotspot policing in communities. You have community policing and partnerships, and so on. What's real important, of course, is to have cooperation between all the agencies if you want to solve problems. So, I think it's important to have, when I worked in the field, I try to work, cooperatively with all these different agencies to have a better result for, the client, basically, or the situation. And so that's important to recognize. But you're going to have turf battles, and you're going to have organizational issues, and that's important to recognize as well, that systems don't tend to operate like, these fine-tuned machines or something of that sort, but, they're like out-of-tune guitars, and you try to tune them up a little bit. Sometimes it helps, but you got to beware to break a string if you press too hard. In other words, that, change is slow in that regard. Change is slow many times, and so we're always seem that we're behind, and that is problematic. There's a really fascinating discussion on undercover operations, reverse sting, controlled buys, by bust, by walk, and so on. Also, from the legal perspective, a discussion of entrapment. And according to your authors, entrapment occurs when police agents acting as undercover induce the arrestee to commit a crime that was not contemplated beforehand. So, you know, there's all kinds of interesting features related to that. Discussions of knock and talk and consent searches, crackdowns, weed and seed programs, drug diversion programs, and asset forfeiture. So we read a lot about that, where law enforcement, rather the criminal justice system, can the government can seize cash and property, homes, for example, from those involved in the narcotics, or rather the drug business. Some interesting information about the RICO laws. And again, you know, to me, trying to study all this is sometimes mind-boggling, because there's just so much to grasp. You know, if you think about, if you're working as a law enforcement officer, you have to know all those laws and how they apply, and how and each situation may be slightly different, and so certainly you have to do a lot of training and keep up in the you know, on the current legal statutes and everything. But also you have to work within a community. You know, you have to work in a community, gather community support and trust, and that's real important. And to know your alternatives. You know, arrest versus you know, citation versus, you know, getting someone involved in a treatment program. You know, and a lot of that depends on you know, the community and what's available, the age of the person, the type of drug, and all that. So even for me to try to comment on all that in our ever-changing society, you know, that what I say today might change tomorrow, and they say, that old man, he doesn't keep up with the literature, he doesn't know. No, because things change rapidly. I mean, look at what's happening with laws and regulations related to marijuana. Now, that's probably the big one to look at, because there's a lot more going on there than with a lot of the other drugs. But, you know, take a look at that. And the debates and the changes, and again, you know, comparing different states, and very fascinating to do, but really a lot out there. And of course, when it comes down to the exam, I'm going to try to give you a detailed review guide to help you focus on, you know, some of the more general themes that run through this chapter, but some really excellent material. There's a lot in there, and this wraps up this video.